Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in tonight for what promises to be a lovely session. My name is Maahliqa, and I'll be your host this evening. For tonight's Writers Speak event, we have with us the lovely Lan Samantha Chang to discuss her new novel, The Family Chow, published actually just this year in February. So I'll begin by introducing Samantha, and then she has very kindly agreed to read to us. And then we'll move into like a general discussion about the book. Lan Samantha Chang is the author of the short story collection Hunger, as well as the novels All is Forgotten, Nothing is Lost, Inheritance, and of course, The Family Chow. Her work has appeared in the Atlantic Monthly, Plowshares, and the Best American Short Stories. She has already also received fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, and the American Academy in Berlin. Samantha is also the first Asian American and female director of the Iowa Writers Workshop. So over to you, Samantha.
Thanks very much, Malika. Okay, I have this book. It's a new book. Um, I'm going to read from about 40 pages into the book because I didn't want to do the opening. It's a scene that takes place in a small Midwestern city. There are three brothers and their dad. The novel is kind of a Chinese American restaurant succession novel. Um, and what I decided would be probably most helpful would be to describe one of the tensions that's leading up to this conflict that happens about halfway through the novel. There's an unexpected death, and nobody knows exactly what the nature of that death is. But I'm going to know is that previous to this particular scene, there's a very dramatic family gathering at a restaurant, and the family dog Elf, escapes. The brothers are named, the oldest is named Dago, and then the middle one is Ming, and the youngest one is James, and this is the scene between Dago and James. And it's called A Big Fish in a Small Pond. James remembers it this way. The winter after Ming went east to college, their mother, now working too hard, came down with a bad cold that turned into pneumonia and sent her to the hospital. Dago left New York, where he had been living on kitchen jobs and gigs as a bass player, returned to Haven, and moved into the old family apartment over the restaurant. James's big brother was in town again, charismatically uncombed and unshaven, loquacious and needy, pressing James into assistance as he cast extraordinary spells of pungent, savory magic in the restaurant kitchen, reminiscing about New York, dispensing guidance about the world at large. The two of them spent hours and hours watching football and playing video games in the apartment. It was Dago who took to calling James Snaggle, a joke on James's crooked front tooth and a play on the transliteration Sango, and Dago who nicknamed their puppy Elf, a joke on Arf. His given name was Bruce Lee Chow. Dago took up enough space for two brothers, although there remained, whenever James thought of Ming, a wordless space, a question mark, a pause. In mid-afternoon, as James climbs up the snowy steps to Dago's bachelor apartment, he remembers it as a place of refuge. He opens the door with anticipation and nostalgia. Snaggle! His brother's deep, husky voice emerges from the other room. Check this out. I'm just going to skip the description of the room, but let's just say that there's like an animal head on the wall, and it's dark. Dago, a barefooted bear in a cave, hunches at his laptop, its glow lighting up the high, ruddy contours of his face. James is reminded vividly of their father, sitting with his glass of baijiu in the dark. But Dago is typing away at the laptop with an air of furious industry. Hey, Dago. Hey, Snaggle. Dago moves a pile of red stationery from the couch. James lowers himself into the empty space, and the smell of leather suffuses him. It's like sitting in an enormous baseball glove. A glass is put into his hand. James sniffs the strong odor of alcohol. Beneath the leather and the alcohol, He can sense the comforting interest his brother has always taken in him, the generous interest of a larger, stronger animal nudging a youngling. "Come on, try it. Tell me what you think," says Doggo, pointing at the glass. "I'm bringing out the best stuff for you." James takes a sip. "It's strong," he says, his throat burning. "It's not as strong as his father's, by Joe, but he doesn't say so." He picks up a sheet of red paper. It says, "You are invited to the annual Christmas party. Delectable dishes and special libations by Dago Chow. Fine Chow Restaurant, December 24th, 6 p.m." Dago sticks out his chest. "This year, Ma asked me to take over the food for the Christmas party. Well, I'm planning the best fucking party ever. Ba doesn't want me as a partner? I'll show him." James remembers the old woman's warning to Dago. "Stay away from that restaurant. You're inserting yourself into a story you don't know." "Who did you invite?" he asks. "I sent these paper invites to Ma's friends, but now I'm thinking I'll invite everyone." Dago waves his arm in the direction of the equipment on the table. James peers at the tangle of wires. His brother calls himself, quote, "an audio gook." "What's this box?" Dago grins. "This is an illegal transmitter. I bought it for a few $100 off a guy who convinced someone to drag it here from China in his suitcase. I wait until it's dark and put it in the attic." He nods at his laptop. "I'm making notes for tonight. Tune in to 88.8 between 1 and 2 p.m. a.m. tonight for Pirate Radio, FM 88.8. Lucky number. I've been broadcasting for weeks. I don't know if anyone listens, but I don't care. I'm going to invite the whole world to my party." "I'll tune in," James promises, making a mental note. "It's great to see you," he says. "I came to the restaurant last night. Where were you?" Dago closes his laptop. He gestures for a tumbler, and James hands it to him. "It's a long story." He takes a gulp. "I'm in kind of a jam." "Are you going to talk to Ba?" "Never." Dago takes another gulp. "I would tell you all about it, James, but it's too depressing." "But you're picking fights with Ba. You're drinking in the afternoon. What's going on?" Dago sets down the tumbler. "You're full of questions, aren't you, Snaggle? Well, you know my old dreams of living in the city, of living as a small fish in a big pond until I make it as a musician? Well, I'm done with that. I've given up. I'm ready to settle down for good in Haven, to be a big fish in a small pond, but the problem is I'm not big enough to do it." He buries his face in his hands. James feels a surge of love for his brother. Dago never hides what he's going through. "Is this why you broke up with Catherine?" he asks. Dago sighs. "Are you disappointed in me for breaking up with her?" James shakes his head. "Then you really are on my side. Because, of course, everyone else loves Catherine more than they love me. There's a kind of woman, Snaggle, who's above all a good woman, such a relentlessly good, upstanding person that it's impossible to be in love with her. That's Catherine. She even looks like a pillar. Such smooth skin, so straight and pure with that long neck, and understanding and forgiving and solvent, all of it. And yet why is it such a struggle to love, to feel an essential tenderness toward her?" "Didn't you love her?" Dago considers. "I think I admired her, Snaggle." James's thoughts, questions crowd each other, but he can think of no reply. "Are you wondering how is it possible to have sex with someone out of admiration? Well, the answer is it's not hard at all." "She's pretty," James says, now red in the face. "She's exceptionally good looking, and good. She's way too good for me. That's the problem. It turns out I want a woman who is equally as bad as myself." Dago straightens up and frowns at his toes again, wiggling them thoughtfully. "The question is not why I slept with her, or even why we went out for so many years, but why did I get engaged to her? How did that happen? How did we go from perfectly cordial dating, which had been going on since God knows when, best friends, every day as pleasant and uneventful as the one before, to pledging to spend our lives together? She is my best friend. Since she took that job in Chicago and followed me back to the Midwest, our romantic life has slowly evaporated, but it didn't really matter until last year or so." "Dago, what's going on?" Dago reaches down, digs his right finger between his smallest toes, and twists it around. He brings it out, examines it, and sniffs it. So maybe we were engaged for so long it became more and more obvious that we were never going to get married. But words were spoken, promises made. When we were barely out of college, I gave Catherine Ma's old ring. It was from Ba's side of the family, I guess, and when I started bringing Catherine home, Ma gave it to me. You've seen it. Do you remember it? James tries to recall. A green stone, the color and clarity of lake water, shimmers from somewhere in his memory. A big chunk of super rare jade with a complex gold setting, some Asiatic panther with spots of diamonds wound around the jade. It's the only thing Bob brought from China. It was the one thing he ever gave to Ma. I honestly don't think he inherited it. I figure he won it somewhere gambling during those years he spent in Macau. Ma told me there were still a lot of old things tumbling around Macau, left over from the gold and jewelry people bought out of the country and saved and gambled and lost. Anyway, I gave her the ring. We were serious at the time. Words were spoken, promises made, unborn children were imagined and named. We were 22 years old. We get engaged. Everything is fine. And then, well, a decade goes by. I don't even know. I don't even know if it's just one day or gradually, but it's not fine. I realize I don't want to be married to Catherine. I ignore this because I'm a shit. I don't want to be the bad guy. I want her to break up with me, throw me aside so I can come across all clean here in Haven. To Ma, Ken Fan, Mary Wah. Why do I give a flying fuck about what they think? Anyway, this goes on for years, me torturing myself back and forth, and Catherine, well, I think she knew. I believe she knew I was waiting for her to break up with me, and so she just didn't. Then it happens. One day, someone walks into the restaurant and my life is changed. And it's imperative, crucial that I break up with Catherine and get the ring back. Who is it? Hold on. So I try. I have no dignity. I beg her to break up with me and give me the ring. Dago twists the tumbler in his palm. She won't do either thing, of course. You may think breaking up is unilateral. It doesn't take two people to break up, but you're not dealing with Catherine. First of all, she knows everyone we know. They call her whatever they need to find me. She talks to Ma every week on the phone. It's like she's their daughter, and I'm the shitty son-in-law. I can't even forget her birthday. They're all reminding me. They all want to know the present. He imitates Mary Wah's quack. What did you buy for Catherine? And this is because they know the truth. She has no reason to stay with me. She could find someone in a snap. He tries to snap his fingers. So why doesn't he? Why doesn't she, he moans. Why doesn't she just fucking find someone else? He breaks off and stares at James imploringly. I don't know, James says. Because for Catherine, a promise is a promise. Words are not only words, they are as real as real. Those imaginary Han children, they are real children. So what do? I sleep with someone else. I fall in love, but secretly, because I can't bear to have anyone else think I'm a cheating scum. Now, I really need the ring. So what do I do but go back and say the most humiliating thing possible? In the long silence, James wonders how Dago thinks he's keeping his relationship with Brenda Wazacek a secret when everyone seems to know about it. I'm telling myself I'm not a creep because I'm just going to take the ring from her, I'm not just going to take the ring from her, and so I offer her $10,000. After a startled moment, James clears his throat. Wouldn't that make her feel, well, undignified, Dago? Wouldn't she believe that you assumed she could be bought? No shit. Of course. Of course it's ridiculous and humiliating and rude and awful. I don't know why I did it. I was desperate. I was a crazy man. Here I am entirely without dignity, begging her to let me give her $10,000 so she'll understand we're broken up and give me back the family ring. He stops for a moment, lost in thought, and, of course, she won't take it. She doesn't need the money. She's gotten through that fancy law school. She's working at this evil accounting firm in Chicago. Catherine is rich. This is undoubtedly true. Yet there remains one central question about Catherine, separate from the ring and even from the money. Why won't she let you go? Because she says I'll change my mind. She says she knows I'll change my mind, that I really love her, and anyone else I ever want is just a fling I need to get out of my system because we got together so young. She'll wait, and I'll come back to her. Um, do you think it might be true? No, there's someone else. I'm not even sure Catherine thinks it's true. It's more like an oath. It's what she tells herself because she's decided it's true. I don't think she loves me anymore. She smiles at me, and I'm afraid she's going to slap me. But still, she smiles. She smiles. Surely it can't be that bad. Of course she doesn't want to slap you. Wait a minute, Snaggle. It gets worse. He stops, gathering his strength to speak. James waits with a sinking heart. Do you think I went to Catherine with a bag of cash and tried to buy the family ring outright? That would be bad enough, right? Well, what I did was worse, Snaggle. I didn't have $10,000. I didn't have $2,000. I went to her empty-handed and told her, I need the ring right now. I told her I'd buy it back, but I'd have to owe her. James flinches. Don't tell me anymore. I have to tell somebody. And who else will listen? Who else could love me after I finish the story except you, Snaggle? So now she knows, Snaggle. She knows. What do you mean? She knows I don't have any money. Doggo's face is wrung up in misery. I've been keeping up an elegant lie, telling her dad pays me well, driving down to visit her in Chicago, blowing my salary on dinner. She thought she was engaged to a bustling restaurateur, but she figured out I don't have the $10,000. And she's not a fool. She knows that if I don't have $10,000, I don't have a cent to my name. So then to make it even worse, A half a minute of silence passes. What did she do? James waits, determined to hear his brother out, but Doggo won't finish his sentence. James prompts him. Why do you need the ring so much? Another silence, even more prolonged and obdurate, this time for longer than James can bear. He blurts, You're in love with Brenda Wazacek. An intense flame of yearning opens up Doggo's heavy-set features. Then almost as quickly a scowl battens them down. It's not what you think. I don't want to give the ring to Wren. Wren doesn't even care about the ring. She wouldn't want it. Why do you want it back then? For the family? For Ma? Doggo hunches his big shoulders. I want to sell the ring to these obsessive Qing antique collectors from Taiwan because Wren wants to live rich. Money is more important to her than anyone in the world. He lowers his voice. I haven't told anyone. I signed a lease on this swanky 8th-floor penthouse across town over in Lakeside, starting January 1st. I'm going to surprise Brenda with the penthouse. Ask her to live with me. James recalls his father's words, and now the dog wants a bigger house. Did you tell Ba about the lease? I had to. I can't afford the rent. I asked Ba for more money. He said to break the lease, but I can't. It would hurt my credit. Ba just laughed. He says, You tried to bite off more than you could chew, so I set up the luncheon to ask him for the partnership of the restaurant. Do you have to live in Haven? Does Brenda want to stay here? Probably. Doggo shakes his head. I'm tired of focusing on geography. It's a family obsession. There is no perfect place. It's just that for people like us... What do you mean, like us? We chows, who are full of passion and inner chaos. None of us can bear to be in our present lives. We're charged up with unrelenting ambition for the future. It's why Ma and Ba came to the States. Or we're sad about what might have been. Ba says he wishes he hadn't left China. Ma's trying to get back to a time without Ba. I'm 33 and I want to be 19 again. We want to travel back in time, but we can't. And so we go to a new place instead. Place is what we have instead of time. No, not true. Money is what we have now, instead of place or time. He exhales. Time is money. Place is money. Love is money. And power is money. You'll see. I don't want to be like that, said James. Ah, says Doggo, but you are. You heard what Guling Jucher said to you. No, I didn't. I forget you have such bad Chinese. Well, Ma told me all about it. Guling Jucher read your I Ching on your palm, and then she stood there and told you your fortune. Do you want to know what it is? James is certain he doesn't want to know. But more urgent than this certainty is the desire to know. If you and Ma know what it is, he says, then so should I. Okay. Well, she said you're going to come into a lot of money, Snaggle. You're going to find and lose more money than some men make in a lifetime. You'll live a big, important life, and you'll grow up into a powerful man. You're going to have adventures, expansive, challenging adventures. You're going to live in many places. You're going to remember everyone you ever knew, and you'll take on their burdens for them. Love is going to matter to you more than anything else, and the burden of your love and the love of your life is going to be unrequited. What do you mean? Unrequited. That means not returned. Dago lifts the tumbler and drains it. Oh, I know, kid. When you get your big important life, when you're making your deals, don't forget about your old brother here. Dago, James says, it's Alice. I want to sleep with her. Give him up, says Dago miserably. Women are crazy, Snaggle. But James tries again. Does unrequited mean that I'm not going to have sex with her, Dago? No, Snaggle. His brother's voice is sad. It doesn't have to, Snaggle. Dago, what Guling Jucher warned you about? To stay away from the restaurant. Is she right about that? Is it true? Yes, Snaggle. It's true. Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much, Samantha. That was a lovely reading. So I guess one of the first things that I wanted to talk about, like to kickstart this discussion, was so this book is essentially a retelling of the Brothers Karamazov. So I guess I want to know, and I'm sure our audience would like to know why, why the Brothers Karamazov, what drew you to it?
Oh, sure. I mean, the fact is, I just became obsessed with the brothers Karamazov. It was like, I didn't read it until I was 40, and it hit me the way that some things hit a person in midlife, that I had just read this great work of literature and I just loved it. I mean, I suppose I could sit down and try to figure out why I loved it. I have three sisters, so I wonder if I'm just interested in same-sex sibling drama. My father was this very tyrannical, like very intense and charismatic person. Um, I think that's probably part of it. And then also, I just loved the scope of the book. It has this extraordinary sense of just extreme extremeness, extremity. It goes from one emotion to the opposite emotion. The characters are really complicated and contain a lot of contradictory feelings. It felt very much familiar to me. And I think the reason is that I grew up in a very dramatic family. And then I'd never written anything like that before. Everything I'd written was kind of low key, kind of. I say like immigrants living lives of quiet desperation, and this novel is immigrants living lives of noisy desperation. I just really admire Dostoevsky also, in the way that like the way he writes is so unrelated to the way I was taught to write. It's
Um,
loud, you know, tons of dialogue, just a lot. It's just very different. And so, I don't know, I absorbed the novel, and then at some point, I realized that I wanted to try to write an homage to the novel. If that makes any sense.
no, that makes perfect sense. One of the things that I was thinking of, especially since this is a retelling, what were the challenges involved in, I mean, not just retelling the Brothers Karamazov, but also sort of remodeling it and restructuring it into a story that is inherently, like it inherently now occupies its own space. Um,
Right. I mean, the first challenge was getting over my lack of confidence, um, because there's something really, I mean, there's so much hubris involved, right? Like, why? Why would I try to write a book based on this extraordinary book? It's just a recipe to screw up. And also, I did question myself a great deal. And then I was lucky enough to come across an essay on homages from Margot Livesey, in which she said that when she wrote her book that was based on Jane Eyre, she basically stopped reading Jane Eyre. And that's when I realized I had to stop reading the Brothers Karamazov, set it aside. And after I had set it aside for, a few months, I was able to really start working on my book. And it became its own book. So I mean, the structure has some of the same elements and similar set pieces to the Brothers Karamazov, but there's a lot of it that's not the same. Um, and I was able to do it the way I did because I wasn't looking at it. Does that make sense? It took its own place in my head and it imagined itself. And so, it became a novel and I started to tweak it and change it and revise it in ways that made it work as a novel, but um it was not uh it was not with the Brothers Karamazov in mind. It just started to be its own thing, and that's why I was able to work on it. You had mentioned you wanted to talk about the structure, but I'm curious to know specifically like what parts of the structure you're curious about.
So one of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of structure is I think firstly I find the pacing very interesting. The first half of the book sort of occurs over a few days and then suddenly like the book shifts and it works very well. But I was wondering how the process of writing that, like what did the process of writing that look like for you?
I mean, for me, I have always written in little bits surrounded by white space. So I'll write a book. I think my last book was 150 pages and it took place over like 30 years. And it was just scenes from some people's lives that were connected, but all the stuff in between was cut. And when you do that with anybody's life, you can make any kind of narrative out of it, and it was fascinating to me. But I had never written anything that unfolded slowly. So the first 150 pages of this takes about 3 days to do. And I got that idea. That is one of the ideas that I got from reading the Brothers Karamazov, in which the first 500 or 600 pages unfold over a few days. Um, and it was just a challenge or an experiment for me to see if I could slow down, make my pace, um, sort of just move through time differently, submerge in time differently, and not leave. Do you know there aren't very many of those white spaces where time has passed, except when people are sleeping. And everything that everybody eats, I mean, everything that the main characters eat is pretty much described. So you're really following them. It would be like putting a camera on a dog's head and like letting it walk through the house. That's what it felt like to me.
And it's interesting that you say that because the book sort of opens with a dog, Alf, sort of walking around, and it's almost like there's a camera on his head, and that's how you get introduced to many of the characters. So I wonder if you could talk more about Alf and like dogs and
Sure.
this through line that
Al-
exists.
Alf was necessary because there are so many characters in the book that the only way I could get James, who was the point of view person for most of this, to, well, not most of it, but for at least, close to half of the book. Anyway, the only way I could get James to encounter all the characters, and thus for the reader to encounter the characters, was to propel him through like a number of conversations taking place in different parts of this town. I had to do a couple of things in order to make that work. I mean, in the Brothers Karamazov, people are constantly giving Alyosha, the James character, notes. And, he has to like go talk to so and so, go talk to so and so, go do this. But I did not think that that would really work in my version. So I did a couple of things. I got rid of James's cell phone because that way he has to actually physically go to places. It was kind of interesting. His cell phone gets wet and he has to put it in a bag. He has to take the battery out and put it in a bag of rice. So he can't use it. And then another thing I did was Alf Alf runs away in the first big set piece and James is basically trying to find him. And that's how James comes into contact with Catherine and Brenda, the two women that Dago is hung up over. Um, and that's how James um, sort of propels James through a couple of places. There is a dog in the Brothers Karamazov, one in particular, but not until the second half. I just suddenly wanted to write a book in which there were a lot of dogs, references to dogs, and like a special dog.
There's something you mentioned earlier, which I sort of wanted to come back to. You mentioned how you, especially like one of the things that drew you to the Brothers Karamazov was these siblings, and they're all of the same sex. Um, and having like two sisters myself, I think that is something that sort of draws me to stories. But in retelling the Brothers Karamazov, did you ever think of like changing the genders of the main characters?
Sure, it was one of my first thoughts. Um, and I thought about it for years. I would reach points in the drafting and think, well, you could still change it now if you wanted to. And then at some point, I just didn't. And the reason I didn't is that, as I said, I grew up in a family with three sisters. I know exactly what that's like. I have a tyrannical father, not a long stretch to the plot. The three sisters want to kill their tyrannical father. Too close. It just wouldn't have involved imagination on my part. I just know that. I know about sisters. I've written about sisters. And it just felt like it would almost be cheap for me to do it because I have sisters. I was more interested, I mean, I guess in the last maybe 15, 20 years, I've been really interested in writing about things that are not from my personal experience directly, only because at a certain point, I began to get bored with things that I knew very well, if that makes any sense. Um, it was almost like I could imagine how I would describe something, and that wasn't of interest to me. I seem to only really get absorbed in projects that I can't imagine, if that makes sense.
I think that's very interesting because and I would like to perhaps talk more about writing from a place of not like having like, for instance, a lot of this book sort of occurs, especially the first half of the book, it's very interior, like you're really entering the minds of these brothers. So was that challenging?
No, oddly enough, they just walked onto the page. I don't know how to describe it. They're slightly different than maybe in their first drafts, but this scene that I read to you, most of it is exactly the same as it was the first time I drafted it. Like Dog's desperation and his like completely like fucked up logic, like his messed up emotional logic, all of that was already in it. And I don't know where it came from. I think these people just were in my head and they really wanted to get on the page. Um, it was fun. Uh, I it I think that one of the reasons it was so much fun was um, whenever I start a project, I seem to I seem to only be able to get into it if I think that it's impossible. Like in my last book, I remember it's a story about some poets in an MFA program and what happens to them after they graduate, and it takes place over 30 years. And I remember writing it and thinking, no one will ever read this because nobody gives a shit about what happens to people in MFA programs. It's just not, it's just not something I could imagine an ordinary person reading. And it's funny because it's almost like I have to believe that it's impossible or that it won't work out in order to do it. It gives me a kind of a sense of privacy. And I have to feel it genuinely. Like I can't just trick myself into thinking it isn't going to work. I have to be so sure it's not going to work that the only thing that really matters is writing and not what'll happen to the writing, and then it becomes fun. So this book, I thought, boy, what a crazy project, and I can't imagine that it's possible. And then I was able to do it.
I mean, needing privacy and having this sense of privacy while you write, um I think that actually allows for a space of being as creative as you want with what you're writing. I actually wanted to ask you, who was your favorite character to write?
Oh, wow. Well, I mean, Leo just jumped off the page. I mean, he just jumped onto the page. He was the first character I wrote. So I guess in a way, it's Leo. And I also really like Dago. I'm very fond of him. He screws up all the time, but his heart is in the right place. And I'm also very attached to Ming because I think Ming is a big mess. He's the middle brother, and there are whole sections from his perspective, and he really has kind of a breakdown in this book. And also, I just feel for Ming because he's got so much self-hatred, and I understand why. Like, I can understand the forces that make him feel the way he does. So, I don't know. I liked all of those characters. I think I liked all of the characters, to be honest. Another one that I really enjoyed was Catherine. Like, when the first time I wrote the book, Catherine was not portrayed sympathetically. She was just this woman you're wondering, like, why is she still going out with this man after all this time and he wants to break up with her? Like, why is she hanging on to this person? And then as time went on, over many drafts, she developed into a character that I actually genuinely liked to the point where at some point I put some passages in her perspective because I felt like I understood her and I sympathized with her. She's she's great. So yeah, I don't know if I have a favorite. I liked a lot of them. I liked Fong a lot, James's friend. I really like him.
He was a fun character, especially towards the end of the book. I think circling back to structure, I find it interesting that towards the end of the book, um, the structure sort of like it breaks away, the perspective breaks away from the three brothers a bit with like the inclusion of blog posts and like social media. And I was wondering if like you'd like to talk more about that.
Sure. A couple of things in the Brothers Karamazov. The first person omniscient narrator, who's kind of a anonymous community member, um, he becomes present in the courtroom scene. There's a courtroom scene, and he says, I was there. And for the first time, it felt to me like he had a body and he was in a place. And I thought it was so interesting because even when that happened, you could tell that what he was there for was to be a witness to this spectacle. And I thought, if there were a trial like this, it would be it would go viral because people like to read stories about, like, maybe an Asian family that's a complete disaster, in which something just completely crazy happens with crazy elements to it, which I can't name all because I don't want to be a spoiler, but there's this like viral element to what happens. And I just I needed to be able to show that in this way from the community perspective. But for me, it wasn't simply the Chinese American community. I wanted to show it from the community at large, so the online community as well. So there's this whole section that's written in comments to this news article about the trial, where like everyone has to weigh in. There's the guy who says, oh, yes, I went to China. That's where I met my wife, and I know this and this about the Chinese culture. I mean, we've all met this person, but then there are people who are like, this is outrageous. Like, this is making all Chinese people look bad. Like, this family is a disgrace. Or people are like, that Brenda, it's all Brenda's fault. She's this horrible white woman. She's a disgrace. It was a lot of fun to write about that. And it ended up, after a few drafts, fitting in with this idea that I had that the first half of the book was the story of this sort of problematic and surprising death from the point of view of everyone in the family and the people who knew them. Then the second half became sort of a larger picture of how society would see this story, and some of the tropes that get projected onto the story. And it was just fun to do that.
I actually loved that section with the social media comments. That was that was one of my favorite sections of the book, actually. And in a lot of ways, this is a story about community. It's a story about this, how and about the model minority myth. I mean, it sort of
Yes,
pushes back
yes.
against that. So, and I did have some questions about the process of writing that because, as a writer of color, it's like you're pushing back against, your own community and then other communities as well, and that can get hard. So, like, what was writing that like?
I didn't want to write a novel in which all the Asian people were perfect because it felt like it would be false and that I would be writing according to some kind of idea about how I should write. And so I wanted to write a character also about, to write about a character who was just problematic to everyone. I mean, the problem is Leo's just I actually really like Leo. I find him sort of charismatic and amusing and very, in his own way, very much himself. But he's awful. Like everyone hates him. Like his family's upset with him. The women in the community are upset with him. The men in the community are embarrassed by him. And then outside of the community, everybody, once they get to know him, people think, he's not great. But yeah, nobody in the book is perfect. I was deliberately pushing back against this idea that Chinese characters have to be perfect. I don't really think that brings us anywhere as a community. I think that if we feel like we have to have perfect characters and behave perfectly at all times, then we're just giving into this model minority myth, which the myth that all Asian immigrants are like just fine. Everything's fine. Asian immigrants are the well-behaved ones. This idea that some people of color are like well behaved, and others by definition are not. And what that does is it puts the well behaved ones in a box just as much as everyone else is being put in a box. And sadly, sometimes it's a box that people assume willingly. I mean, some of the people who write the comments are like, I'm an Asian person. This is an embarrassment. These people are horrible. And then someone else writes in and says, who says we all have to be perfect? You know? And I wanted that conversation to be out there.
And
And
for a
how
lot
it
of
felt, I think the way it felt is that I feel like I'm old enough now because I'm quite old now and I went through this. I mean, my whole family went through like being like completely isolated in a primarily white town where we were sort of, in many ways fortunate to grow up, and in other ways, it was a little traumatizing. Um, that we went through this. I wanted to write about it for years. I don't think that our society would have been interested in a book that explored these issues, and I feel like finally the world has changed and I can write it. I started it 15 years ago before things had really changed, but I was just tired of not writing about it, and now it just happened to be published in an era when not only could it be published, but possibly made into a TV show, Just it's interesting to me how much things have changed. But certainly things have changed to the point where somebody could write honestly about characters who weren't perfect.
and for much of the book, Ming exists in that box too. And I find that interesting as well, how within the same family, three sons can turn out so differently.
Absolutely. Well, each of them was brought up at a different point in their parents' immigration experience. So, Dago's like the big hopes and dreams of, the newly arrived, new business, new family, the whole thing, the son. And then Ming is sort of things have be started to, they've started to see that things aren't perfect. And Ming um, Ming, as a middle child, resents their favoritism of Dago and decides he's going to be perfect, which is a problem for him. And then James, who's brought up by the time his parents have been in the country for so many years that, like, pretty much he's brought up without learning very much Chinese because his brothers bring him up and they speak to him in English. His parents are working really hard. His brothers, speak to him in English, and so he really doesn't have much Chinese at all.
Um, And I also found the decision, and we have a question from someone in the audience, and I'll turn to that in a bit. But you mentioned that like you lived in a town that was primarily a white town, and I noticed that in the book, Leo Chow, sorry, Leo Chow is the first Asian American to settle in Haven, Wisconsin. So that was an interesting decision because he's also not the most likable character within the Asian American community and outside of it. So like, how did that come to be?
Well, he owns the restaurant and he's a good cook, so people come to him because they want the food. Also, Winnie's a really good character. Everyone likes Winnie, and so they put up with him because they like Winnie. That's my theory about that particular couple. Um, I think that their experience in their town is probably taken from similar to the experience that my family had when we basically, according to my big sister, integrated Appleton, Wisconsin. Um, and Appleton, there are great things about growing up in the Midwest. Don't get me wrong, but it's like the birthplace of Senator Joseph McCarthy. It's got a very strong streak of political conservatism and is very homogeneous. I don't know. I Yeah, I don't know if I answered your question.
No, I think you did, and I think the book also sort of explores that with the competition that sort of exists between the Fine Chow and that other diner,
Of the other
the
restaurant.
other restaurant, which becomes very important um, in like the plot.
Yeah, it does, the plot.
um, Someone asked if there was a particular part of the Brothers Karamazov that you wanted to rewrite or reimagine.
I never thought that. Well, okay. I didn't. I mean, I wrote this book out of admiration and love, but rereading it now, because see, when I was writing it, I wouldn't let myself read the book for like 6 or 7 years. And so now I'm finally rereading it. And I'm like, wow, I don't really know about Catherine's character or Brenda's. They're not, I don't feel the same sort of warmth coming from those characters as I do from the male characters. I mean, I think Dostoevsky writes amazing female characters in Crime and Punishment, for example, but and in this book too. But they don't. I just realized that they're not as well drawn as the male characters.
And I noticed that in the family Chow, one of the things that you have done, even though the female characters, they don't always have a lot of agency because of like the kinds of men that they're surrounded by, I do notice that they are actually the characters who, in a lot of ways, drive the plot forward, and they're quietly sort of there, like Winnie.
Yeah, Winnie.
Um, yeah, so I wonder what the process of writing that was like because you sort of do it in a very subtle way.
I mean, the thing is that regardless, the book is going to be about three brothers and their father's relationship. And so, in a way, I felt like the female characters were under, they were underplayed. And I couldn't, in the plot itself, and I couldn't, I mean, I thought about changing one of the characters into a woman, and I did. Okay, I did ultimately change one of the characters into a woman, but I can't describe it because it's a spoiler. However, the three brothers are still men, and so I think the problem was that I had to make the female characters. I mean, I'm naturally inclined to make them movers and shakers, and so I had to do it in sort of like indirect ways at various points in the plot. But I mean, I think I was in some ways stuck with the premise and then just had to work within it. That's all that's about. Also, I revived the mother In the Brothers Karamazov, there's two wives. Among the three brothers have two mothers among them. But in my book, they all three have the same mother, and I made her a character. In the Brothers Karamazov, the mothers are dead.
And
There's
I
a
think
whole set of female characters in the book that are also related to the Buddhist female spiritual house, which I invented instead of the sort of male monastery in the Brothers Karamazov.
I liked the scenes with the spiritual house a lot. They were very interesting. And I think the book sort of like starts actually at that spiritual house. And then this becomes a story about like, and I think The Brothers Karamazov, I haven't read it, but I think it grapples with these existential questions. And I think The Family Chow does that too.
That's great that you say that. I do feel that, I mean, if there were one thing I could change about my book, I would make it, I mean, to make it more like the Brothers Karamazov, I would make it a more overtly religious book. But the fact is, like, it's not. I think in order to write a book like that and set it in contemporary US, it would have to be set in a completely different kind of community with different concerns. Um, and the plot would be different. The whole story would be different.
I do have one last question for you
Sure.
before we um, sign off for the night. Um, so obviously you were inspired by Dostoevsky, but were there any other writers who you turned to or in conversation with in this book?
Yes. Actually, I was really interested in Philip Roth while I was working on this book. I know he's not like wildly popular at the moment. Uh, I was interested in his career because frankly the extraordinary amount of energy running through all of the work and the degree of sort of linguistic talent is just remarkable. And one of the things that I found interesting, I for this particular book, because he writes different kinds of work, some of his work is really Apollonian and some of his work is really Dionysian. I was interested in his humor. The two books that I looked at particularly were Sabbath Theater, which is his most Dionysian work, and Patrimony, which is the story of the death of his father. And Patrimony in particular had passages that I found like really kind of lighthearted and warm and also very funny. Um, my favorite passage in that book is a description of buying a cantaloupe, like how to buy a cantaloupe, and how the character is defending his stepmother because the father is criticizing her for being unable to buy a cantaloupe. And the Philip Roth character defends his stepmother by saying that like it's impossible to buy a cantaloupe, that you look at it and squeeze it and sniff it and you do all these things to it and then you bring it home and you cut it open and it's a disaster. And he says that like he'd rather buy a car than a cantaloupe. And then he escalates and said, I'd rather buy a house than a cantaloupe. And I guess the thing that cracks me up about it is that the humor escalates. He doesn't usually just tell one joke. He escalates it twice after. And it's not just in that book. I found it also in Sabbath Theater. He'll make a joke, a dirty joke, and then he'll make it again bigger, and then he'll make it again. There's something so pleasurably oral about the work, and I really enjoyed that sense of speech and voices. It was one of the reasons I wrote this in the present tense, because I feel that people often tell stories in the present tense. And yeah, I just really enjoyed the spoken voice, the sound of the prose. So that's one person that I read a lot when I was working on this. I also read I read over and over and over Elizabeth Bowen's essay on notes on a novel. Um, I probably have internalized that so much that, I don't even think about it consciously. Anyway, so
And I think this book, like it's got a murder mystery, it's a courtroom drama, it's got a little love triangle, and it's deeply funny. There are some really humorous moments in it. And I think, yeah, it's just a great book and everyone should read it.
aw, thanks.
I think so.
Thank
It's
you.
great. Um, well, Samantha, this has been great. Thank you so
Well,
much.
thanks, Malika. It's a real pleasure. It was such a pleasure to talk to you, and I
It was lovely
appreciate.
speaking you too. And thank you to everyone who's watching. So yeah, see you next week. I think next week we've got E. Briskin and Luann Walker for the next Writers Speak Wednesday. So tune in then. Okay,
Bye bye,
bye.
everyone. Thanks.